My name is Alex, and before the encounter I was just an average guy, a little interested in the unknown, but nothing too much. However, ever since this encounter it feels like I've shifted. It's like my perspective on everything has changed. I was never one to dwell on the abstract or the supernatural. I was more a facts and figures kind of guy. If you couldn't explain it with numbers and charts, it didn't hold much weight for me. But this encounter, it really shook me. It's like a veil was lifted and I found myself questioning things I'd always taken for granted. Suddenly the world felt bigger, scarier, but also more intriguing than it had ever been. It was as if I had been given a sneak peek into a dimension I never knew existed. I was at my uncle's place, helping him with some renovation work. He lives pretty much in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest. Not exactly my cup of tea, but family is family. My uncle's property, it's a good chunk of land, mostly forested. It's quiet, peaceful to a point, but also kind of eerie. In a way, it feels like you're stepping back in time when you go out there, with the forest stretching in all directions, untouched by the modern world. Not to mention, the nearest neighbor is miles away. During the day, you could appreciate the solitude and the beauty of nature, but at night, the isolation could feel a bit unsettling. It's just you and the wilderness. And as I found out, maybe not just you. I didn't know much about local legends or anything. I'd heard stories from my uncle about weird stuff happening in the woods, but I thought he was just trying to scare me, you know? Typical stuff. I wasn't a believer, I suppose you could say. Then one evening, while I was taking a break, I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a person hunched over, but as I looked closer, I saw it wasn't. It was pale, almost sickly looking. Not ghost white or anything, just off. It was on all fours, but its body was oddly proportioned, like it was supposed to stand upright. It was disturbingly quick, too. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen. It was strange to say the least. It was as if it was struggling against its own form, the way it moved. Imagine watching a person trying to run on all fours, but at a speed that seemed unnatural. It was just not right. And the paleness of its skin was almost like a light in the dark, like moonlight reflected on a calm lake. It gave off an uncanny vibe. Something inside me screamed that this was very wrong, definitely not something that belonged in the world as I knew it. I froze, I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as it clicked, the noise echoing around the silent woods. Its face had those large black eyes, no nose, just this gaping mouth. Like something out of a nightmare. But it didn't approach me. It just looked at me, then turned and sprinted off into the woods. When our eyes met, it felt like time stopped. I remember the chill running down my spine, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. It just sat there, clicking. The sound was alien. It had this weird rhythm, almost hypnotic. Its face haunts me to this day. Those enormous black eyes felt like they were staring right into my soul. The lack of a nose in that open mouth, it was something straight out of a horror movie. But it was real as the cold beer in my hand. And then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it vanished into the dense forest, leaving me alone with my shock and fear. After it was gone, it took me a few minutes to collect myself. Once I got back inside, I didn't go back out, not until the sun was up. The next day I packed my bags and left. I couldn't stay there knowing that that thing was out there. From then on, I was more cautious. More aware, I suppose. And that's the real kicker, isn't it? How something like that can make you see things differently. After the creature had gone, I sat there in silence, my mind racing. I felt a sudden urge to pack my bags and leave, but I forced myself to stay put until dawn. It was a long night, filled with every creak and rustle magnified by my heightened senses. When I finally left the next day, the forest no longer seemed peaceful. It felt different, charged with a new sense of awareness. It was a harsh lesson about the mysteries that our world still holds, a reminder that there's so much we don't know. The experience made me more cautious, more observant, not just of the wilderness, but of life itself. It's funny how a single encounter can jolt you out of your usual path, make you question and, in a way, open your eyes to the possibilities. It changed me and made me more curious and more open to the unexplained. My name is John Collins, a scientist by day but also a nature enthusiast with an insatiable curiosity for the mysteries that lie hidden within the natural world. I've always been drawn to the unexplored corners of our planet, seeking out remote and lesser-known areas. It was during one of my solo expeditions to the rugged forests of Northern California that I had an encounter that defied explanation. It was a warm summer day as I ventured into the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Towering redwoods stood tall, casting dappled shadows upon the forest floor. The date was June 12, 2019, a day that would forever be etched in my memory. Guided by an unyielding curiosity, I ventured deep into the forest, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of wildlife. And then, a peculiar sound reached my ears, a subtle rustling amidst the dense undergrowth. My heart quickened, sensing that something extraordinary awaited me. With cautious steps, I followed the source of the sound. Every fiber of my being was consumed by anticipation and an unexplainable thrill. And there, in a small sunlit clearing, I beheld a creature that defied every preconception I had. The creature stood before me, its body adorned in sleek charcoal gray fur that shimmered in the sunlight. It possessed a muscular frame, a blend of bear and ape, hinting at a predatory agility and strength. Its forelimbs were elongated, contributing to its slightly hunched posture, while the hind limbs appeared shorter in comparison. But it was the creature's face that held me captive, a convergence of human and animal features. Its prominent snout bore a striking resemblance to that of a bear, complete with a damp black nose. Yet it was its eyes that held my gaze captive, piercing and wise, as if they carried the weight of millennia. Time seemed to freeze as we locked eyes, and a connection passed between us, unspoken and profound. It held no hostility or aggression, only an unspoken understanding that I was a respectful observer in its domain. The creature's rounded ears swiveled independently, attentive to its surroundings. Moving with a blend of grace and purpose, the creature exhibited a primal allure that awakened a mix of fear and reverence within me. Its presence embodied the fusion of animalistic power and ancient wisdom, a living embodiment of forgotten legends. My hands trembled as I attempted to capture the moment, desperate to preserve this surreal encounter. But the creature, as if sensing my limitations, chose to retreat into the depths of the forest. It vanished with a swiftness that left me spellbound, disappearing into the emerald embrace of the towering redwoods. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet the memory of that encounter lingered, etching itself into the very fabric of my being. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved deep into the annals of folklore and local legends. But despite all I found, skepticism prevailed, and few dared to believe in the existence of such a creature. Undeterred, I sought out experts in the field of cryptozoology, desperate for any lead that might shed light on the enigma I had witnessed. Some dismissed my account as mere fantasy, but a select few seasoned researchers shared tantalizing fragments of information. They spoke of a hidden realm concealed within the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, where cryptids roamed, veiled from prying eyes. The creature I had encountered was said to be a guardian of this realm, a sentinel charged with safeguarding its secrets from human intrusion. Though the world may dismiss my encounter as mere illusion, I carry the weight of truth within me. The creature I encountered in the remote forests of Northern California remains nameless, shrouded in the allure of the unseen. I stand as a witness to the delicate balance between belief and skepticism. We are but explorers, seekers of knowledge, forever on the precipice of unraveling the secrets that lie beyond our understanding. So let the skeptics scoff and the naysayers dismiss. I will continue to embrace the mysteries that nature presents, venturing into the unknown with reverence and an unyielding determination to uncover the veiled secrets that lie hidden within the redwoods of Northern California. Ever since I was young, I always wanted to be in the medical field. I was a certified nursing assistant for a couple of years before I eventually entered medical school. I worked in a nursing home in a small town in Michigan. When you work in a nursing home, you essentially grow the size of your family. You become so close with them. You meet their family, learn about their lives, look forward to their stories, laugh with them, cry with them, and even though it's hard work, it's very rewarding. I can't tell you how many patients have told me that I was like a child to them. These patients will always have a special place in my heart. There was this lovely old woman named Mrs. Clark who was always full of life. She always wore this old red hat and her teeth were terrible. Despite these quirks, she was by far one of my favorite patients. About 2 weeks before she died, she would talk about these 3 little girls that were following her around. Every time I would check on her, she would have new stories about what these 3 little girls recently did. As she told it, they'd say crazy things to her, make her laugh, show her their toys, and she always had a new story about these girls. I never saw any of these girls, obviously. I figured it was just her dementia playing tricks on her mind at the time. Then Mrs. Clark passed, and it was one of the hardest deaths I've had to deal with as a CNA. Then a new patient, Mrs. McConaughey, ended up moving into her room. She was a very calm and cheerful old woman. She always had a smile on her face and never caused any problems. She was gentle as a lamb, and being in her presence was very soothing. She reminded me of my own grandmother, and I would always spend extra time with her. Then all of a sudden, Mrs. McConaughey started talking to me about 3 little girls that would visit her. They would tell her about their days, they would bring her toys, tell her jokes, and dance around her bed. Every time I visited her room, she had a new story about these 3 little girls. It was too coincidental, and I started to really listen intently to Mrs. McConaughey when she would talk about these 3 little girls. I knew for a fact that there weren't any actual young girls that were visiting her. Initially, I thought there had to be someone's daughters that would visit the nursing home, but only Mrs. McConaughey was seeing them. Then, Mrs. McConaughey passed away. Shortly after that, we had the next patient move into a room named Mr. Mason. Mr. Mason was awesome. He was really kind-hearted and jovial. He was always a gentleman, and he would tell the best stories from his past. Most people his age like to tell the same stories over and over again, but Mr. Mason always had a new, amazing story to tell. He was really funny and could always get the whole room laughing. He was very active in the nursing home activities, and everyone just loved him. A couple of weeks before he died, Mr. Mason started mentioning the 3 little girls. He would talk about how he loved how playful they were and how happy they always were. This really freaked me out. He was the 3rd patient in a row to talk about these girls. Nobody else in the nursing home was telling stories about these 3 girls. It was just the patients in that particular room. It was very unsettling. Then one night, my coworker Sarah and I were both assisting Mr. Mason in getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, he asks me, "Who's that standing next to you?" I replied, "Don't be silly, Mr. Mason. You know Sarah, you see her all the time." He shook his head and said, "No, the other one standing next to her?" Sarah and I both looked at each other, and I could feel the adrenaline shoot through my limbs. This was getting to be too much. In fact, it was becoming absolutely terrifying. Mr. Mason passed away later that evening, and I relocated shortly after that, but couldn't get these 3 girls out of my mind. Years later, I made a shocking discovery. I was visiting friends down the street from that nursing home and learned that there had been a terrible fire at the location years before the nursing home was built. There was a barn that caught fire, and 3 little girls were burned alive. I'm sure my eyes went wide when I learned those facts, but I kept my thoughts to myself, knowing that my story would never sound possible. When you work with the sick and the elderly, you develop a unique relationship with death and energy. Strange things often happen to people when their time comes, and I feel like pretty much every nurse has some crazy story to tell. But I think about those 3 little girls a lot. I wish that before I moved away from Michigan, I could have done something to help those girls move on into the next life. Before I die, I would like to return to that room and at least tell them that it's okay to move on. I'm no supernatural expert, but I know that something is keeping them from moving on into the afterworld. The face Mr. Mason made when he asked who was beside Sarah was really disturbing. I'm thinking that whatever or whoever he saw is what is keeping them there. I hope I can figure it out. My name's Jake. I'm an avid hiker from Oregon. I thought I'd share something with you that happened to me a couple of weeks ago while hiking in the Cascade range. So I was in the Cascades on a solo trip. I wanted to spend some time alone with nature and figured there's no better place to do so than the Oregon wilderness. I was on my third day of hiking, aiming to reach a remote alpine lake that I'd heard was particularly beautiful this time of year. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something unusual. I was navigating a steep trail, still a good hour from the lake, when I heard an unfamiliar noise echoing through the trees. It was a low growl that didn't match anything I've heard in the wild. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't sound right. Too deep, too guttural. A sudden foul stench hit me next. A mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't quite place. A sulfurous smell. My heart started racing, and I knew instantly something was off. I've seen my share of wildlife in my time, but this was different, almost unsettling. And then I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as my vision focused, I could clearly see this massive creature standing upright about 50 yards away. It was tall, around 8 feet by my guess, with a massive body that looked like it belonged to a bodybuilder. I noticed a thick, dark mane around its neck and shoulders, resembling a cape draped over its wide shoulders. Its legs were thick and muscular, like those of a dog, yet they ended in what looked like human feet. The creature's face was partially hidden by the shadow of the trees, but I could make out a long, broad snout and 2 pointy ears that looked similar to a German shepherd's. It let out another guttural growl. Despite the fear, I was entranced. It was terrifying yet fascinating. The wilderness had always been a source of peace for me, but in that moment, I felt fear. I also felt a strange sense of wonder, the kind you feel when confronted by something utterly foreign, something that challenges your understanding of the world. Still trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I instinctively reached for my phone to take a photo. But the creature's ears twitched, and it quickly turned its head towards me, revealing a face that was eerily dog-like, yet somehow monstrous. The snout was broad and looked almost like that of a Doberman pinscher, while the mouth revealed a double row of teeth and terrifyingly large fangs. Its eyes were not visible in the shadow, adding to its unnerving presence. With a realization that felt like a punch in the gut, I remembered the sounds I'd heard earlier. That low, guttural growl must have come from this creature. I was on its turf now. All my years of hiking and outdoor experience seemed to pale in the face of this unknown entity. Suddenly, the creature let out a howl, a sound so haunting and eerie it still gives me chills to think about. It was nothing like a typical wolf's howl. There was something almost human about it. I was frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The stench of rotting meat and sulfur was even stronger now, and it took all my willpower to keep myself from gagging. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the creature looked at me and then, surprisingly, turned and disappeared into the dense forest, its huge, humped back and wide shoulders visible until the trees swallowed it. It didn't run, didn't seem scared. Rather, it moved with a strange grace, like it had all the time in the world. Once it was out of sight, I stood still listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath along with me. After what seemed like an eternity, the silence was broken only by the distant chirping of birds. It was over. But I was left with a pounding heart and shaking legs. After the encounter, I was in shock for a while, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I quickly packed up and made my way back to my camp, every little sound making me jump. I stayed awake all night, startled by every noise, half expecting the creature to return. But it didn't. Once I was out of the woods and back to civilization, I tried to research what I had seen. I found tales of mythical creatures, folklore, but nothing that really matched what I had encountered. I've also reached out to local wildlife experts, but so far no one can explain it. It's like nothing anyone's heard of around these parts. I still hike, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm out there in the wilderness. The world feels a little different, a little less familiar now. I hope sharing my experience might help me and maybe others who've had similar encounters feel less alone. My name is Jack, and I'm a bridge welder by trade. You might be wondering why a guy who spends his days working on bridges is writing to a show host about mythical creatures. Well, even welders need hobbies, right? Mine happens to be hiking. It's a welcome break from the welding mask and torch, and I get to enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. Last weekend, I decided to take a solo trip through the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. I was halfway through my usual trail, savoring the feeling of the earth beneath my boots and the sound of leaves crunching, when I noticed something was off. The usual woodland noises, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, were replaced by an eerie silence. That's when I smelled it. Sulfur. A strong, nauseating scent that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was as though someone had lit a pile of rotten eggs on fire right in the middle of the forest. I've been hiking for years, and let me tell you, that smell isn't normal. And then I saw it. Standing a distance away in a clearing was this creature, a thing straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, easily reaching 8 feet tall, and its body was a bizarre mix that reminded me of a lizard and a goat, with bat-like wings folded at its sides. Its skin was brown and scaly like the rusted beams I often repair. The face, though. It was terrifying, glowing yellow eyes boring into mine. It looked oddly like a horse, yet twisted into something monstrous. A long tongue flicked out of a mouth filled with sharp teeth. And the way it looked at me, there was an intelligence there that made my skin crawl. The creature didn't just stand there. It moved, revealing more of its bizarre appearance. Its black skeletal body stretched grotesquely as it unfurled its wings. They weren't exactly bat-like as I initially thought, more dragon-like, leathery and huge, casting an ominous shadow on the forest floor. The thing's legs were bent, similar to a goat's, but with an eerie skeletal thinness to them. The creature's long tail whipped restlessly behind it, moving with a strange agility that contradicted its otherwise ungainly appearance. And atop its terrifying face, 2 horns protruded. They were twisted and dark as if scorched, adding to its demonic aura. Its eyes continued to glow, a chilling yellow that seemed to pierce through the semi-darkness of the forest. And every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of its long tongue darting out, flicking through the air as if tasting it. But what was truly bone-chilling was when it made a sound. A low rumble echoed through the clearing, almost like a growl, but with an unnatural resonance. The kind of sound you'd expect to come from a creature of nightmares, not something standing in front of you in the flesh. The encounter didn't last long after that. It seemed to lose interest in me, those glowing eyes shifting away. With one powerful leap, it was airborne, those monstrous wings beating against the air and causing a rush of wind that nearly knocked me off my feet. The last thing I saw was a silhouette disappearing into the darkening sky, leaving nothing but the sulfurous smell and the haunting memory behind. After the creature flew off, I was left in a state of disarray. With my heart still hammering in my chest, I began the hasty trek back towards civilization. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. As a bridge welder, I'm used to finding solutions to structural problems. But this was beyond any logic or understanding I was equipped with. Once I reached my truck, I found my hands were still shaking. I sat there for a while, the scent of sulfur lingering in my nostrils, replaying the encounter in my mind. Eventually, I turned the key in the ignition and began the drive home, the image of the creature's glowing yellow eyes etched in my memory. Over the following days, I tried to go about my daily routine. The sound of welding filled the days and gave me a sense of normalcy. Yet every now and then, I'd find my thoughts drifting back to the creature. The smell of sulfur seemed to follow me too, no matter how many showers I took or how many times I washed my clothes. I did some research, thinking I'd stumbled upon a yet undiscovered animal, maybe even a new species. The more I read, the more I came across tales of the Jersey Devil. Every description I read matched what I'd seen. The lizard-goat body, the horse-like face, the sulfurous smell. I'd always dismissed such tales as folklore, but there was no denying the uncanny similarities. I've even returned to the Pine Barrens a couple of times since then, drawn by a need for answers. I didn't see the creature again, but I did find strange tracks and once again encountered that awful sulfur smell. And it's not just me. Other hikers have reported similar sightings and smells in the same area. My hope in writing to you is not only to share my encounter, but to find some answers. Maybe your listeners can shine a light on this encounter in the comments section. Help me understand what we've experienced.